The cotton stretched endlessly under the Alabama sun, white bowls gleaming against dark earth like stars trapped in mud. His hands moved with the rhythm born of necessity, fingers bleeding through worn cloth wraps, but his eyes stayed locked on the distant sky, where a single contrail carved through the blue. Most boys his age dreamed of escaping. These fields through factory work up north or lucky breaks that never came, but he dreamed different. He dreamed of flight, of breaking free from gravity itself, even though everyone said boys who looked like him weren't meant for cockpits. The overseer's voice cracked across the rows like thunder, pulling him back to the weight of the sack, dragging behind him, back to the reality that seemed as fixed as the sun's path overhead. His grandmother told him stories at night while they sat on the porch, stories about people who refused to accept the world as it was handed to them. She spoke of kingdoms in Africa where his ancestors were scholars and warriors, not property, not sharecroppers bound to land they'd never own. When he mentioned the airplanes, she didn't laugh like the others didn't remind him about the walls built by Jim Crow and hate. Instead, she squeezed his shoulder with her calloused hand and whispered that the sky belonged to God, not to men who made cruel laws. That permission was all he needed. To keep looking up, to keep imagining himself among the clouds, while his body moved through the cotton like a machine. The dream burned in his chest brighter than the Alabama heat, more persistent than the hunger that gnawed at him each night. News traveled slowly to their corner of the world, arriving in week-old newspapers and radio broadcasts, crackling through static. But when word came of a new program, of colored pilots training somewhere called Tuskegee, something ignited inside him that couldn't be extinguished. The other field workers shook their heads, warned him about getting hopes up, about the dangers of reaching for things meant to stay out of reach. His grandmother, though, she just nodded slowly and began mending his one good shirt. That night, under stars that suddenly seemed closer than ever before, he made a decision that would carry him from these Alabama fields into the savage skies over Europe, though he couldn't possibly imagine the impossible thing he'd eventually do. The bus that carried him away from everything he'd ever known rattled through backroads and segregated towns, crossing state lines that meant nothing to the heat and everything to the men who enforced the color barriers. He sat in the back section marked for colored passengers, his grandmother's carefully mended shirt pressed flat in the paper sack between his feet, watching. America scrolled past the window like a country he'd never truly seen before. At every stop, white soldiers boarded freely through the front, while he and the handful of other colored recruits waited for permission to move, to breathe, to exist in spaces that seemed to reject them by design. The contradiction wasn't lost on him, called to serve a country that wouldn't let him drink from the same fountain as the men he might die beside. Tuskegee Army Airfield emerged from the Alabama landscape like something conjured from imagination, its runways shimmering in the distance as their transport finally pulled through the gates. The other candidates clutched their bags with white-knuckled grips, faces carved from determination and terror in equal measure, knowing they'd been selected not just to fly, but to prove something the world insisted couldn't be proven. Their white commanding officers watched them disembark with expressions ranging from open hostility to cold calculation, measuring them against invisible standards designed for failure. One captain, his jaw set like granite beneath his peaked cap, made it clear from the first formation that he expected most of them to wash out within the week, his voice dripping with the kind of certainty that came from never having been told he couldn't achieve his dreams. The physical demands came first, running until his lungs burned like the cotton fields under August sun. Calisthenics that turned his muscles to liquid fire, obstacle courses designed to break bodies and spirits simultaneously. But the farm boy had been built by years of labor that started before dawn and ended after dark, his frame lean and powerful from work that never forgave weakness. Where others, Stumbled, he endured, channeling every insult from overseers past and present into fuel that kept his legs moving when they wanted to collapse. The white instructors pushed harder when they saw he wouldn't break, inventing new torments, new reasons to disqualify him. But his grandmother's hand on his shoulder lived in his memory, like armor against their contempt. Inside the classroom, they faced another kind of warfare: navigation, aerodynamics, mechanical systems, meteorology. Subjects most of them had never encountered in the colored schools that received leftover textbooks and half the funding. He studied by flashlight after lights out, memorizing equations and aircraft specifications, until the numbers danced behind his closed eyes, determined that knowledge would be the weapon they couldn't take from him. When he finally climbed into the cockpit of a Stearman biplane for the first time, hands trembling on controls that represented everything impossible made real, the instructor's skeptical voice crackled through the radio, asking if he was ready. He was already gone, lifting into the Alabama sky that had always been waiting for him, proving that some dreams refuse to die, no matter how deep you bury them in doubt. The silver wing ceremony took place on a blistering afternoon when the Alabama heat turned the parade ground into a shimmering mirage. Each graduate, standing rigid in dress uniform while commanding officers pinned the coveted insignia above their hearts. He felt the metal weight of those wings settle against his chest like a promise finally kept, like his grandmother's prayer answered in aluminum and determination, though she'd never lived to see this moment that defied everything the world told her was possible. The other graduates stood beside him, men who'd become brothers through shared torment and triumph, their faces betraying nothing of the emotion that threatened to crack their military bearing. When the white officers saluted them, however reluctantly, however briefly, something fundamental shifted in the air, a microscopic redistribution of respect earned through excellence that couldn't be denied even by those who desperately wanted to deny it. The orders came through within days. Assignment to the 332nd Fighter Group, stationed at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy, flying combat missions over occupied Europe as part of the 15th Air Force. The briefing officer's voice carried technical precision as he described their role: bomber escort duty, protecting flying fortresses and liberators on deep penetration raids into the industrial heart of Nazi Germany, where Luftwaffe fighters waited like wolves circling a wounded herd. They would fly the P-51 Mustang, the sleekest and deadliest fighter in the American arsenal, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine capable of speeds that turned the aircraft into a silver bullet at altitude. Their planes would be marked with distinctive red tails, an identification system that would become either a badge of honor or a target depending on whether they proved themselves worthy of the machines they'd been given. The transport ship crossing the Atlantic carried them through submarine-infested waters, the converted freighter rolling in winter swells that turned the cramped quarters below deck into a carnival of misery and fear. He spent hours topside when permitted, watching the grey ocean stretch endlessly toward a war that suddenly felt terrifyingly real. No longer an abstract concept from newsreels, but a destination racing toward him with the inevitability of sunrise. The other pilots played cards, wrote letters home to families who might never receive them, or sat in silence contemplating the mathematics of survival in a profession where rookie pilots often died on their first mission. He thought about cotton fields and impossible dreams, about how far he'd traveled from that sharecropper's shack to this steel deck pointed toward combat, wondering if courage was something you possessed or something you discovered only when there was no choice but to find it. Italy revealed itself through winter rain and mud. Ramitelli Airfield, a collection of tents and metal Quonset huts arranged around runways carved from farmland. The Apennine Mountains rising in the distance like ancient witnesses to the carnage unfolding across Europe. The P-51s sat in revetments like resting predators, their red tails bright against the grey landscape, each aircraft representing 400 miles per hour of American engineering and lethal purpose. His hands traced the smooth aluminum skin of the Mustang assigned to him, feeling the coldness of the metal that would either carry him home or become his coffin at 20,000 feet above enemy territory. The crew chief, a colored mechanic from Detroit with grease permanently embedded in his knuckles, looked him in the eye and promised the engine would never quit, that every system had been checked and rechecked because their lives depended on trust that extended beyond what any manual could codify. The first mission briefing felt like sitting in a church where the sermon concerned salvation through violence, the intelligence officer's pointer tapping against maps, showing the route to Munich, where ball-bearing factories kept the German war machine grinding forward, despite Allied bombing campaigns that had already turned entire cities into smoking monuments to industrial-age destruction. They would rendezvous with the bomber stream at 15,000 feet over the Adriatic, then climb to escort altitude, where oxygen masks became necessary and the cold could freeze moisture in your eyes if you blinked too long. The white bomber crews wouldn't be expecting much from the red tails. He could read that assumption in every intelligence report, every casual dismissal from officers who'd been told that colored pilots might be adequate, but would never match the performance of their white counterparts in actual combat, where hesitation meant death and excellence was measured in bombers brought home safely. The P-51 came alive beneath him, with a roar that shook his entire skeleton, 1,200 horsepower, transforming fuel and air into forward thrust that pressed him back against the seat as the runway blurred past and the wheels lifted free from Italian soil into the realm where gravity became negotiable and death waited in every cloud. Formation flying demanded absolute concentration, maintaining precise position relative to the other Mustangs while scanning the sky for the tiny dots that could resolve into enemy fighters in the seconds between detection and engagement. The bomber stream appeared ahead like a massive aerial convoy, dozens of flying fortresses arranged in combat boxes designed for mutual defensive fire, their unpainted aluminum fuselages catching sunlight like a declaration of American industrial might sent directly into Hitler's face. He could see the waist gunners tracking their approach, 50 caliber machine guns following the red-tailed fighters with suspicion that cut deeper than any flak burst could manage. The radio crackled with the bomber pilot's voice, flat and professional, but carrying undertones of doubt that didn't require translation. They'd heard the stories about colored pilots, believed the propaganda that suggested courage and capability, followed racial lines that no amount of training could cross. Then the sky erupted, with German fighters diving from altitude, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs materializing like angry hornets, whose nest had been kicked by the bomber formation's intrusion into defended airspace. His thumb found the gun trigger as he broke formation to intercept, the Mustang responding to control inputs with predatory eagerness, tracers reaching across empty air toward an enemy who discovered too late that the red tails weren't the easy targets their intelligence had promised. The dogfight lasted minutes that stretched into subjective hours. Aircraft spinning through three-dimensional chess matches, where mistakes converted instantly into smoking debris, falling toward the earth far below, parachutes blossoming occasionally like white flowers marking where men chose silk over burning metal. He stayed with the bombers even when easier kills presented themselves elsewhere, understanding that their mission wasn't personal glory, but protecting the heavy aircraft whose crews were discovering that skin color meant nothing compared to the competence displayed by pilots who'd earned their wings through standards that exceeded what prejudice wanted to believe was possible. The briefing room smelled of coffee gone cold and cigarette smoke layered thick enough to sting the eyes. Morning light cutting through Venetian blinds in horizontal slices that striped the faces of men who understood this mission would be different from anything they'd flown before. The commanding officer stood before a map where red yarn traced their route deep into the heart of Germany, all the way to Berlin itself, a distance that would push fuel reserves to their absolute limits, and place them over the most heavily defended airspace the enemy possessed. Intelligence photographs showed flak batteries clustered around the capital like iron thorns, protecting a dying rose. Anti-aircraft, guns that could fill the sky with explosions capable of shredding bombers into component parts before their crews even registered the danger. The target was a synthetic oil refinery whose destruction would cripple German armor divisions, already retreating across multiple fronts, but reaching it meant surviving fighter concentrations that German Air Command had pulled from every available airfield in a desperate attempt to stem the tide of Allied bombers, turning their homeland into rubble. Every pilot in that room understood the mathematics of aerial warfare, where numbers mattered as much as skill, and the intelligence officer's voice carried grim certainty when he announced they'd be facing upward of 30 enemy fighters concentrated specifically to break through the escort screen and slaughter the bomber formation before it could reach the target. The farm boy felt his hands grow steady rather than shake, some quiet part of his mind recognizing this as the moment that would define everything his training had prepared him. For every doubt he'd endured from officers who believed the color of his skin predetermined the content of his character. Around him sat pilots who'd become brothers through shared struggle against an enemy that existed both in the sky and on the ground in their own country, men who'd proven themselves repeatedly, yet still faced skepticism from the very bomber crews they'd been assigned to protect. The briefing concluded with synchronized watch checks and weather reports predicting clear skies over the target, nowhere to hide, nothing between them and whatever waited in the frozen air above Berlin except skill, courage, and the fragile aluminum skin of their Mustangs. Walking toward his aircraft felt like moving through water, each step deliberate and weighted with awareness that some of the men around him wouldn't be walking back. Statistics converting into empty bunks and letters written to families who'd already sacrificed so much. The ground crew had painted his name beneath the canopy rail during the night, a small gesture of respect that meant more than any official commendation could convey. Recognition from men who understood that mechanics and pilots shared the same fate when machines failed at 20,000 feet. He performed his pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, checking control surfaces and ammunition loads while the sun climbed higher over Italian mountains that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to where they'd be flying within the hour. The engine caught with a throaty roar that transformed mechanical components into something approaching sentience, the Mustang trembling with contained power that would soon be released into the deadly ballet of combat, where split-second decisions separated survival from oblivion painted across the sky in smoke and falling debris. The formation assembled with practiced efficiency, red-tailed fighters slotting into position as they climbed toward rendezvous altitude, where the bomber stream would appear like a massive flock of metal birds, whose protection had been entrusted to men that much of America still refused to see as equals. Radio chatter remained minimal and professional, voices acknowledging waypoints and altitude changes, while beneath the calm exchanges lay understanding that today would test everything they'd learned, everything they'd overcome, everything they represented to both those who believed in them and those who'd predicted their failure. He checked his oxygen mask one final time and scanned the horizon where Germany waited, somewhere beyond the curve of earth and cloud, a destination that promised violence and perhaps validation if they could bring their bombers home safely. The mission clock started counting down the minutes until they'd cross into enemy territory, and in that suspended moment before chaos, the farm boy from Alabama allowed himself one quiet breath of gratitude for the unlikely journey that had brought him from cotton fields to this cockpit, from invisibility to a position where his actions would matter in ways that transcended the prejudice that had tried to define his Limitations. The bomber formation had penetrated 40 miles into German airspace when the radio crackled with urgent warnings that made every pilot's blood crystallize into something colder than the thin air outside their canopies. Contrails appeared first as chalk scratches against the blue vault of sky, streaming down from altitude like deadly. Calligraphy written by an enemy that had been waiting with predatory patience for precisely this moment. The farm boy counted them as they materialized from the blinding disk of the sun, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. More than 30 fighters diving in coordinated attack formation designed to overwhelm the escort screen through sheer numerical superiority. Time compressed into that terrible instant of recognition where training collided with survival instinct, where every simulation and practice engagement became suddenly, violently real as the distance between formations collapsed with horrifying speed. The Luftwaffe fighters came screaming down in a wedge that sparkled with cannon. Fire, their intention brutally clear. Punch through the Mustang screen and tear into the unprotected bellies of the bombers where crews sat surrounded by high-explosive ordnance and thousands of gallons of aviation fuel. Radio discipline shattered into overlapping warnings as red-tail pilots called out positions and threats, voices tight with adrenaline but steady with purpose. Men who'd trained for this chaos, now living inside it. The farm boy's vision narrowed to tactical clarity, his mind processing angles and velocities with the same intuitive understanding that once predicted how spooked cattle would break and run across Alabama pastures. He saw the pattern in the enemy formation, recognized the rigidity of their attack profile, understood in a flash of insight that their coordination was simultaneously their strength and potentially their fatal vulnerability if someone could disrupt it violently enough. His throttle was already forward, engine howling as he rolled inverted and pulled through into a near-vertical dive that would take him directly into the teeth of the oncoming formation rather than engaging from the flanks as doctrine demanded. The Mustang accelerated past 400 miles per hour, control surfaces screaming protest as altitude converted into speed that blurred the world outside his canopy into streaks of color and motion. His wingman's voice shouted something questioning over the radio, but the transmission cut off as the farm boy committed fully to the maneuver, firing continuously as he plunged through the enemy formation like a stone through glass. Tracer rounds reaching out ahead of him in brilliant streams that carved through the ordered German attack. Chaos erupted. Instantaneously, as Luftwaffe pilots confronted a Mustang, materializing directly in their flight path, firing at point-blank range. Their tight formation becoming a liability as fighters broke violently in all directions to avoid collision. Two Messerschmitts clipped wings, trying to evade simultaneously, spinning earthward locked together in fatal embrace, while others scattered like startled birds, their coordinated attack dissolving into individual survival decisions. The farm boy's aircraft shuddered from impacts he couldn't identify as metal and burning, emerging from the far side of the formation with half his instruments dead and hydraulic fluid painting red streaks across his windscreen. But behind him, the German assault had fragmented completely, bombers continuing unmolested toward their target, while stunned Allied pilots watched something unprecedented unfold at 23,000 feet above enemy territory. The world inverted into a kaleidoscope of metal and fire as the farm boy's Mustang knifed through the German formation, his finger locked on the trigger, while 6 Browning machine guns spat tracers that seemed to connect every fragmenting piece of sky with brilliant threads of destruction. Enemy fighters exploded outward from his line of flight like startled fish from a stone thrown into still water, their careful coordination evaporating in the primal mathematics of collision avoidance and survival instinct. He glimpsed faces through canopy glass, young men with expressions transformed from predatory confidence to shocked disbelief in the millisecond before physics forced their hands on control sticks, breaking attack runs that had been planned and rehearsed into desperate individual evasions The Mustang shuddered violently as something clipped his tail section, metal shrieking against metal, but his hands stayed locked on the controls, even as the stick bucked like a living thing trying to escape his grip, his body compressed into the seat by gravitational forces that turned his flight suit into lead weight against his chest. Smoke trails marked the sky behind him, where his guns had found targets, painting black brushstrokes across the blue canvas, while pieces of aircraft tumbled earthward, trailing flame and aluminum fragments that caught sunlight like deadly confetti. Two Fokker wolves spiraled downward, locked in an embrace neither pilot had intended, their wings folded. Together, from the collision his attack had forced, men trapped inside machines that had become their coffins. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions, bomber crews shouting confirmation that the fighter screen remained intact, red-tailed pilots calling out scattered German fighters now fleeing rather than pressing their assault voices. Elevated with adrenaline and something approaching awe, his own breath came in ragged gasps inside the oxygen mask as he fought to level the damaged Mustang, hydraulic pressure dropping toward zero while the aircraft responded to his inputs with sluggish reluctance that signaled serious structural compromise somewhere in the control systems. The bombers continued their steady march toward the target, untouched and unmolested, their formations tight, while thousands of feet below the scattered Luftwaffe fighters regrouped or retreated, their numerical advantage rendered meaningless by 15 seconds of controlled violence that had transformed order into chaos. He banked gently to rejoin the escort screen, feeling every damaged component in his aircraft, protesting the maneuver, watching fuel leak from somewhere in the wing route to stream behind him in a mist that caught rainbow colors in the thin sunlight. The other red-tails pulled alongside in loose formation, their pilots silent now as they processed what they'd witnessed, understanding that something beyond training or doctrine had just occurred, something born from instinct and desperation, and a farm boy's understanding that sometimes you don't fight the stampede from the side, you turn and charge straight through its heart. Victory tasted like copper and fear as the formation turned for home, his instruments flickering between function and failure while Italy remained hours distant across hostile territory. But the bombers flew on unmolested, and that singular fact made every screaming protest from his dying aircraft worth the price his body would pay. The Mustang transformed from precision instrument into wounded animal somewhere over the Austrian border, its control surfaces responding to his inputs with the reluctant shudder of torn metal and severed hydraulic lines that turned every adjustment into negotiation rather than command. Oil pressure gauges flickered into red zones while the engine coughed intermittently, each missed beat sending vibrations through the airframe that he felt in his teeth and spine, reminding him that the aircraft remained airborne through mechanical stubbornness rather than engineering integrity. The bomber crews maintained their formations ahead and above, their flying fortresses continuing toward the target with geometric precision, and he understood with absolute clarity that his job wasn't finished until those men returned safely to Italian soil, regardless of what his disintegrating fighter demanded. Fuel continued its steady escape from the punctured wing tank, the stream behind him thinning as reserves depleted, mathematics of distance and consumption playing out in his head with the grim certainty of a countdown he couldn't stop. His hands never left the controls, despite cramping that turned his fingers into claws, muscles locked in constant way correction against the aircraft's tendency to roll left from damaged aileron systems. Radio chatter filled his headset with target coordinates and flak warnings, the mission proceeding exactly as briefed now that the Luftwaffe threat had scattered like leaves before wind. He said nothing, conserving oxygen and energy while his vision narrowed at the edges from sustained adrenaline crash and the physical toll of high-altitude combat that left pilots aged beyond their years in minutes. The bomber stream reached Berlin through clouds of anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into Black flowers blooming and fading, their payload doors opening to release tons of ordnance onto industrial targets far below, while he circled at reduced altitude, unable to maintain formation position but unwilling to abandon his post. Other red-tails stayed close without being asked, their presence both escort and vigil as they recognized what his silence and erratic flight path communicated about the Mustang's condition. Through breaks in the smoke, he glimpsed the city below, a sprawl of grey structures and winding rivers that represented both target and symbol, the heart of the enemy nation now burning from American bombs delivered by men who'd flown through defended airspace, because a farm boy from Alabama understood cattle better than the Luftwaffe understood tactics. The formation turned westward for home, their mission accomplished, and he pointed his damaged fighter after them like a faithful dog following its pack, every mile a small victory against physics and probability. His fuel gauge touched empty as the Alps appeared on the horizon, those mountains representing both obstacle and landmark, the barrier between hostile territory and the relative safety of Italian airspace where emergency fields waited. The bomber crews transmitted their gratitude over open channels, voices rough with emotion as they acknowledged the red tails who'd kept them alive, and he finally allowed himself to believe he might complete this impossible flight. Death had brushed close enough to leave fingerprints on his canopy, but the mission continued forward, carried by will and fumes toward whatever ending awaited beyond those snow-covered peaks. The Mustang kissed the runway with a shriek of tortured metal rather than the usual whisper of rubber, its damaged landing gear collapsing sideways as momentum carried the fighter in a grinding arc that painted sparks across the Italian tarmac like a welder's torch dragged through darkness. He held the stick centered until the aircraft shuddered to stillness, then sat motionless in the cockpit while ground crews sprinted toward him with fire extinguishers raised, their faces showing the disbelief of men witnessing resurrection rather than routine landing. The canopy refused to open until mechanics applied crowbars to mechanisms warped by combat damage, and when he finally stood on solid ground, his legs buckled from hours of sustained tension, catching himself against the fuselage that still ticked and groaned as tortured metal cooled. The base commander arrived in a jeep trailing dust, his expression cycling between fury at the unauthorized maneuver and astonishment at the preliminary reports filtering in from bomber crews already declaring miracles over protected radio channels. Around them, the other red tails taxied to their dispersal points, engines shutting down in sequence as pilots emerged to stand on wings and stare at what remained of his aircraft, counting bullet holes like archaeologists examining artifacts of impossible survival. The debriefing room filled beyond capacity with intelligence officers, squadron leaders, and bomber pilots who diverted from their own sessions to hear firsthand how a single fighter had broken an enemy formation that should have slaughtered half the strike force. He sat at the scarred wooden table with hands wrapped around coffee gone cold, describing the dive in flat declarative sentences that stripped away drama until a colonel interrupted with frustration, sharpening his Alabama drawl, demanding explanation for tactics no manual recommended and no instructor taught. The answer came quietly, almost apologetically, about cattle on his father's farm that would stampede toward danger if you charged straight at them rather than circling wide, how animals and men both possessed instincts that clever pressure could redirect into confusion. Silence followed his words until a bomber captain stood and began clapping, the sound multiplying as others joined until the room thundered with applause that transcended military protocol, white hands and black hands, creating rhythm together in that moment where excellence demolished prejudice through undeniable proof. The gun camera footage arrived before sunset, grainy 16mm film that transformed skepticism into stunned confirmation as the projector threw images against the briefing room wall, showing his Mustang diving into the enemy swarm with tracers streaming forward like luminous arrows. They watched German fighters scattering in panic, 2 colliding in their haste to evade, 3 more breaking formation so violently they became easy targets for the trailing redtails, who exploited the chaos with surgical precision. An intelligence officer rewound the film 3 times, counting kills and probables while shaking his head at maneuvers that violated every doctrine, yet achieved results no conventional tactics could match. The evidence irrefutable despite its impossibility. The base commander signed the combat report with visible reluctance, transformed into duty, his pen scratching across official forms that would travel up command chains to desks where men decided whose valor deserved recognition regardless of skin color. The medal ceremony came weeks later under Italian sun that turned the assembled formation into a sea of shadows and gleaming brass. His name called with full rank before officers who months earlier wouldn't have shared mess halls with black pilots. The decoration pinned to his chest felt impossibly heavy, its weight representing not just personal courage, but the collective excellence of every Tuskegee airman who'd proven that skill recognized no color, that brilliance flourished wherever determination met opportunity. He stood at attention, thinking of cotton fields and his father's quiet lessons about reading animals and weather, those rural wisdoms that had translated unexpectedly into aerial combat, and understood that the real victory wasn't the medal, but the changed expressions on faces watching. Respect earned one impossible mission at a time, dignity reclaimed through undeniable competence that left prejudice nowhere to hide. The years that followed transformed his farm boy's face into something newspapers photographed and history books preserved, though he never grew comfortable with a tension that felt borrowed from every red tail who'd fought beside him through flak-darkened skies. Speaking engagements arrived like missions. Churches in Philadelphia, universities in New York, veteran halls across the South where integrated audiences gathered to hear truths about courage that transcended the color barriers America still struggled to dismantle. He spoke plainly about Tuskegee and combat, about fear managed rather than conquered, and always redirected praise toward squadron mates whose names deserved remembrance equal to his own, men who'd proven excellence when a nation needed proof that segregation was built on lies rather than natural law. Letters accumulated in boxes from bomber crewmen who wrote annual thank yous for lives extended, grandchildren born because German fighters had scattered that March morning over Berlin, gratitude flowing across racial divisions that combat had begun eroding like water-wearing stone. The military integration order came in 1948, presidential decree breaking institutional barriers the Tuskegee Airmen had already demolished through performance impossible to deny or diminish. He was offered promotions and postings in the newly unified Air Force, opportunities to shape doctrine for pilots who would never know separate training facilities or segregated barracks, but chose instead to return home where cotton fields still stretched toward horizons unchanged by global war. His father met him at the bus station with embrace and silence, more eloquent than speeches, understanding without words that some men fight revolutions then retire to tend the land that made them, carrying victories internally rather than displaying them like trophies. Together, they worked the farm through seasons that softened combat memories into stories told carefully to children who'd grow up in a country marginally better because men had refused to accept limitations others imposed. The reconnaissance photograph hung framed in his modest house, grainy aerial image of that bomber formation arriving safely over Berlin, each flying fortress rendered tiny but intact against cloud layers that hid the chaos preceding their survival. Visitors asked about the medals in the wooden box he kept closed, but his eyes always returned to that photograph, showing aircraft he'd protected, lives preserved through split-second decisions rooted in rural wisdom about frightened animals and bold action. The farm boy who dreamed of flying had become the pilot who'd changed military history, yet measured success not in decorations, but in those bomber silhouettes, proving that excellence required only opportunity, that courage bloomed equally in hearts, regardless of the skin containing them. His legacy outlived him by generations. Statue unveiled at Tuskegee, name entering textbooks alongside squadron mates who'd rewritten what America believed possible when prejudice finally yielded to proof. Young pilots of every background studied his tactics. In classrooms where integration was assumed rather than fought for, learning that unconventional thinking often defeated superior numbers, that heritage and creativity were strengths rather than limitations. The cotton fields where he'd worked and dreamed remained, but above them contrails now crossed skies opened partly because one farm boy had charged straight at impossible odds and scattered them like cattle, changing not just a single battle, but the nation's understanding of who deserved to fly, to lead, to be remembered when history measured its heroes. What moment in his story resonated most powerfully with you? Subscribe to discover more untold stories of courage that changed our world.